The sweltering heat of Venice, California in 1969 seeped into Nakamura Karate Dojo, where the smell of sweat, old tatami wood, and lingering cigarette smoke blended into a thick, palpable atmosphere that anyone stepping inside immediately sensed belonged to rules not meant for outsiders. Bruce stood near the center of the training floor, his black shirt clinging lightly to his back and shoulders as he observed the group of students practicing basic technique combinations. He had been invited here through a personal introduction, a small technical exchange among those who truly understood impact, pressure, and the razor-thin line between a wrong move and real injury. The session was supposed to proceed calmly, but his arrival drew curious, yet cautious glances. A few students stole looks, keeping their voices low as they whispered whether that was really Bruce or just someone who resembled him. On the tatami, Michael Harrington, 5th Dan black belt karate master, 6 feet 1 inch tall, over 200 pounds of muscle, was finishing a high-intensity kumite, each strike of his causing the mat to sink slightly. Harrington was the dojo's pride, the standard many students measured strength and technique against. When he turned and caught sight of Bruce's compact frame, he paused, saying nothing, not hiding his cold appraisal. To Harrington, the man on the mat was just a famous face from the screen, someone skilled at making actors look more dangerous than they really were. What he'd heard about speed, about secret fights, he dismissed as exaggerated rumors rather than fact. Bruce Lee continued observing and correcting a young student's movement, his voice soft but clear, every instruction precise and economical. He went about his work, paying no attention to the eyes fixed on him. Harrington, standing not far away, remained silent, watching, waiting to see if the man the world praised was truly different or just a beautiful myth. As Bruce finished adjusting a student's technique and stepped back to the edge of the tatami, the dojo suddenly fell silent, not because the ki stopped, but because Michael Harrington had begun walking straight toward the center of the floor. He said nothing, showed no emotion, but his movement alone made everyone around feel clearly that what was about to happen was no longer part of a regular training session. A few students exchanged glances, their eyes mixing tension and anticipation. Bruce noticed Harrington approaching, but stayed still on the mat, only his focus sharpening, becoming clearer. Harrington stopped in front of Bruce, at a distance just enough not to be seen as direct provocation, but not enough to conceal his attitude. "You're the one I've been hearing the most rumors about lately," Harrington said, his voice not loud, but ringing clear in the dead silent room. Bruce looked at him, not answering immediately. The students standing around began holding their breath, as if any word spoken could make the dojo explode. "I've heard," Harrington continued, "that you're fast." He spoke slowly, stressing each word. "I've also heard you beat a few guys in closed fights." He paused, eyes never leaving Bruce, but they were just guys who liked making noise. The dojo grew quieter. Everyone's attention was on the two men standing in the center of the mat. "What I want to know," Harrington said, "is what happens when you face someone real." He took one more step, voice lower but clearer. "Someone who's been through enough real collisions, not found in any curriculum." Bruce held his stance, no reaction, only his eyes sharpened, as if listening to every word and noting it all without letting it touch his mind. Harrington stared straight into his eyes. "Someone who doesn't care about rules." The air in the dojo thickened further. Many felt a subtle change in the way Bruce stood, not tensing, but becoming more grounded, as if his mind had entered a state ready for whatever came next. "Are you challenging me to fight?" Bruce asked, voice low and brief. "I'm asking you to prove you're not the kind of person people think you are," Harrington replied. "And what kind is that?" Bruce asked. "A hyped-up one," Harrington said bluntly. A few nearby students tensed, as if waiting for the first explosion. Master Nakamura took half a step forward, intending to intervene, but Bruce raised his hand very lightly, signaling it wasn't necessary. Harrington looked straight at him, his challenging gaze unwavering. Bruce spoke slowly. "If you want to know the truth, we'll find out right now." He paused, eyes still calm. "I don't need to prove anything, but you seem to need it badly." Harrington understood instantly that this was acceptance. "This afternoon," he declared. "Right here." Bruce nodded, voice unchanged. "The result will speak for us." No one looked away from the two men. Everyone felt the same thing. This confrontation had begun the moment Harrington stepped forward, and nothing could stop it now. The entire dojo crowded into a tight circle around the tatami as Bruce and Harrington moved to the center. The sound of their footsteps rang out clearly with every step in the sealed space. All eyes focused on the two men facing each other. Harrington took a breath, stepped forward, hips low, body leaning in perfect zenkutsudachi, fists clenched tight. Every karate technique he'd ever learned poured into that stance. Bruce, in contrast, hands low, feet light on the tatami, shoulders relaxed, breathing even. But those with sharp eyes could see clearly that the calmness was not emptiness, but a different kind of readiness. No one had time to count beats before Harrington lunged. His oizuki shot out like a bullet from the barrel, straight, fast, powerful, no wasted motion. A strike any karateka would be proud of delivering with such force. But as the punch flew toward the center of Bruce's chest, he merely tilted his body a few inches, enough for the wind from the fist to brush past his side. Before Harrington could realize the distance had shifted, Bruce fired a short vertical punch so quick it was hard for outsiders to see, a stop hit sinking straight into the center of his chest like a needle prick. Not hard enough to break anything, but enough to make Harrington halt abruptly, breath caught in his chest. A small hun escaped in the already stifling silence. Harrington gritted his teeth and charged again, holding nothing back this time. Gyakuzuki from the rear hand, stronger than the first. Bruce evaded again. Mei Jerry, front kick straight to the stomach, shot forward as if to pierce through. Bruce rotated his hips, stepped right, the kick slicing through air. Mawashi Jerry, roundhouse kick, whipped up with enough force to drop a grown man. Bruce dipped his head slightly, feeling the rush of wind pass over his hair. Not evading by reflex, but as if he foresaw everything about to happen. Each time Harrington attacked, Bruce didn't counter hard, but only touched lightly, at a point on his body, chin, ribs, wrist, as if marking every gap in his opponent's fighting system. The touches were so brief, no one knew what they meant, but Harrington did. He felt them like invisible strokes outlining every flaw in his own technique. Discomfort turned to urgency, then to anger. He decided to close the distance, no longer wanting to play at long-range attacks. He rushed in, aiming to clinch, to lock Bruce with the raw muscle strength he prided himself on. But as his hand touched Bruce's elbow, his whole body was suddenly twisted off balance. Bruce rotated his waist, crossed a step, and his leg swept under Harrington's with icy precision. Harrington lost his base completely and crashed onto the tatami, the heavy, sharp sound of the fall echoing to the ceiling. The surrounding students, startled, as if waking from a dream, for the first time in the confrontation, Harrington slowed. He braced one hand on the mat, struggling to regain breath, but his eyes had begun to change. The iron-clad confidence from earlier was gone. In its place flickered unease, something he didn't want to admit. He stood up, looking at Bruce like a figure impossible to analyze with experience or fighting theory. And then the fragile fear in his eyes shattered into rage. He charged once more, launching a high roundhouse aimed straight at Bruce's head. The kick he usually used to finish dojo matches, powerful wide arc, speed that left others barely able to react. But Bruce didn't retreat. He stepped in. One single step, timed exactly when the kick was at its midpoint of power. He trapped Harrington's arm, spun, and delivered a short knuckle fist to the point behind the ear, a spot that could disorient the entire nervous system instantly. No one heard a shout, no loud impact sound. Only Harrington's body dropping, fast and heavy, as if someone had pulled the plug on a running machine. He lay motionless, eyes closed, breath shallow. The dojo sank into icy silence. No one dared speak. Bruce stepped back one pace, hands loose, breathing still even as when he entered. No arrogance, no excitement, only the absolute stillness of someone who had just demonstrated truth without needing any explanation. A faint groan escaped from the cold tatami, and every eye instantly turned to Harrington's collapsed body. He stirred, eyelids fluttering before cracking open. His first gaze was hazy, disoriented, recognizing no faces around him. He blinked repeatedly, breath heavy, upper body tensing, as if reflexively returning from a place with no footing. The surrounding students collectively stepped back, not out of fear of him, but fear of what they had just witnessed from Bruce. The silence now was different from when the two had faced off. Then it had been anticipation. Now it was wary. They backed away from Bruce, like people retreating from something beyond ordinary understanding, something they dared not approach until certain it had settled. Harrington tried to brace his hand on the tatami, but his body wouldn't obey. He had to try twice before lifting his upper body. His eyes gradually cleared, and when his gaze met Bruce's, a flash of shock passed through them, as if the memory of what happened suddenly rushed back. Bruce still stood where he had retreated after the final strike, hands down, breathing even. No arrogance, no pity, only stillness, a stillness that made Harrington feel stripped bare of the confident shell he'd worn for years. Bruce took one step forward and stopped before getting too close, keeping enough distance so Harrington didn't feel pressured, but couldn't look away. "You fought with the fear of losing," Bruce said, "not with truth." Harrington frowned, his face flushing not from pain but from the sensation of someone seeing straight through the part he most wanted to hide. Bruce continued, "Your technique is good, very good, but your mind isn't steady. An unsteady mind turns every technique against you." The nearby students heard every word clearly, and they too felt the statement aimed at them. But the one most affected was still Harrington. He heard but couldn't accept, or rather, couldn't yet accept. Those words contradicted everything he'd built his belief on for years, the belief that pure strength, discipline, and karate technique were all a fighter needed. He tried to stand, legs trembling slightly, and that bothered him more than the physical pain. "I didn't fight out of fear," he said, voice hoarse, trying to hold on to strength. "I fought because you challenged me." Bruce tilted his head, gaze unchanged. "I didn't challenge you. You rushed at me because you feared others might be right about you. You didn't fight to win. You fought to protect your image." Harrington clenched his teeth. Frustration rose, Not because Bruce was wrong, but because he was right in such a simple way, as if the confrontation he'd seen as the ultimate test of honor was merely the reaction of a man driven by his own ego. "You don't know me," Harrington said, quietly but sharply. Bruce looked straight at him, eyes holding, not confrontation, but understanding that threw Harrington further off balance. "I know how you fight," Bruce replied, "and from the way a man fights, I know what he carries inside." Harrington fell silent. He turned his face down to the tatami for a moment, as if searching for something to hold onto against the feeling of being completely dissected. No one in the dojo moved. Harrington took a deep breath, but it broke midway, as if his chest hadn't recovered from the first stop hit. He looked around and realized the students' eyes were no longer the same as before he fell. They no longer saw him as an untouchable monument. They looked at him as if seeing a real human struggling in his own darkness for the first time. Harrington wanted to deny it all, wanted to see what happened as an accident, wanted to believe his strength remained intact, but every time he tried to build an excuse, the memory of the sweep, the strike behind the ear, and above all Bruce's calm gaze blocked every argument. He couldn't accept it yet, but the truth had begun to seep in, like a small crack in the rock he'd spent his life sharpening. And Bruce, the one who had just shaken that rock, still stood before him, letting the truth find its own way to where it needed to go. Harrington sat on the tatami a long while longer, hands braced on the floor, as if that was the only way to keep his body from collapsing again. He took a deep breath, gathering the last scraps of dignity to speak, voice hoarse and heavy. Why didn't my karate work? It was just a man searching for an answer he'd never imagined having to face in his entire life. Bruce stood before him, looking at Harrington like a student who had just entered the most difficult but most important moment of his life. "Your karate worked," Bruce said slowly, "but the way you used it didn't." Harrington lifted his head, face a mix of confusion and discomfort. Bruce stepped closer, distance just enough for the listener to feel the words aimed straight at his heart. "You attacked believing karate had to win," Bruce continued. "You believed that because you'd trained so much, endured so much pain, fought with discipline, you were automatically right." Harrington's eyes twitched slightly, as if each word struck a place he didn't want touched. "But you didn't attack based on the truth, right in front of you," Bruce said, voice even and firm. "You didn't see me. You only saw the image of me you'd already built in your head." Harrington pressed his lips together. Those words struck straight at the pride he'd nurtured for years. He believed in karate, in technique, in things measured by sweat and blood. But now it was stripped bare with just a few sentences. "I did the technique correctly," Harrington said softly, clinging to the last fragment of belief. "Correct technique." Bruce nodded, but not at the right moment. Not in the right context. Not aligned with the truth of the encounter. Bruce sat down level with his eyes, making it impossible for Harrington to avoid that gaze. "Technique isn't for proving anything," Bruce said. "Technique is only a tool. Its value lies in whether you can see reality or not." Harrington went quiet. All his life, he'd been taught that karate was the path, that if you followed that path correctly, you'd be stronger, faster, unbeatable. No one had ever told him that path could also blind him. Bruce continued. "When I evaded your first punch, you didn't see that I'd already read your intention. You only saw you hadn't struck hard enough. When your roundhouse whipped past, you thought, I got lucky. When you rushed to clinch, you believed your body strength would overpower me. You didn't see that very thought was what slowed you down. Each of Bruce's points felt like a sharp chisel, peeling away the mental armor Harrington had worn through years of training. He looked down at his hands and saw them trembling slightly, not from pain, from realizing for the first time in years that he didn't understand how he fought. Bruce continued, voice neither loud nor soft but heavy like judgment. You didn't lose to karate. You lost to your own ego. Harrington closed his eyes for a moment. He wasn't used to hearing things like this, much less having someone see his weaknesses. But he also knew Bruce wasn't saying it to humiliate. There wasn't the slightest hint of that in his voice. Your tradition is good, Bruce said. Your reputation is well earned. But when you use them to shield yourself from truth, they become burdens. Harrington opened his eyes. Something had just fallen from his face, unseen but felt, a defense, a shell, a long-held illusion. You aren't bound by karate, Bruce said. Voice lighter. You're bound by what you think karate forces you to be. The surrounding students stood like statues. They could see clearly that this was no longer a conversation between two men. This was a rare moment when a human faced himself for the first time. Harrington took a deep breath, this time without breaking. He looked at Bruce, eyes no longer angry, no longer defensive. Only one unspoken question remained. What do I do now? Bruce met that gaze with the stillness of someone who had walked this path long ago. When you stop trying to prove, you begin to see the truth, he said. And when you see the truth, you truly begin to learn. Harrington bowed his head, not in submission, but in realizing that what he'd believed so long wasn't wrong, but it wasn't enough. And that insufficiency was exactly what had nearly cost him himself. In that moment, Bruce had stripped his ego bare, without needing a single strike, only with truth, and it hit harder than any strike he had ever taken. Harrington sat there, hands still on the tatami, breath gradually steadying, but in his eyes, a different kind of stillness began to appear, one not from the fall or the final strike, but from somewhere much deeper. That feeling pulled him back to fragments of memory he'd thought buried beneath layers of iron discipline and thousands of training hours. The old dojo kie echoed again in his head, sharp, bouncing off the old wooden walls of his youth. He saw himself, a skinny young man with a stubborn look, standing at the front of the class, as everyone prepared for belt testing. The old master's shoes, Shiro Tanabe, tapped steadily on the wooden floor, each step like a hammer on his chest. Tanabe was the one who brought Harrington into karate, who saw in him a stubborn but promising seed, but he was also the one who repeated one sentence until it became an unshakable truth in Harrington's mind. Karate is the only path. That wasn't advice. It was a command. It was the steel frame placed in the head of a young man, not yet mature enough to question whether the world might be wider than what he saw. Harrington remembered training sessions that lasted until his legs could no longer hold, hands bleeding, breath burning in his chest, times when Tanabe stood before him, eyes stern yet expectant, saying, "Others can fall, you cannot." It was in those moments that Harrington learned endurance, but he also learned something more dangerous, that his worth was measured by never letting anyone defeat him. The more tournaments he won, the more praise, the more expectations piled up. At national karate tournaments, he heard his name called over the loudspeaker in the finals, applause from the stands, admiration from peers. He grew accustomed to that feeling, accustomed to standing above others, accustomed to being seen as the standard. and accustomed to the growing fear that one day someone would surpass him. In those years, Harrington didn't just practice karate, he absorbed it like doctrine. Every punch wasn't just technique, it was a declaration: karate is right. Karate is strongest. Karate is unbeatable. And in that devotion, he began closing the door on everything else in the martial world. If something didn't come from karate, he saw it as wrong. If someone was strong without using karate, he saw it as an exception, a deception, a trick. He'd heard a few people mention other styles: boxing, judo, kung fu, even Wing Chun, but they all passed through his ears like noise. Tanabe had taught him that all other paths led to error, and he believed. He believed so deeply, he never asked whether that belief locked away part of his soul. His arrogance didn't arise from his nature, but from fear. Fear that if karate wasn't the only path, then all those years of cold training would lose meaning. Each victory temporarily buried that fear, but every rumor of someone stronger, someone not following karate, made that fear surge back powerfully. When Harrington first heard about Bruce Lee, said to be so fast the eye couldn't follow, rumored to have beaten many masters in closed fights, his first reaction wasn't curiosity or respect, it was denial. No one could be like that. No one could surpass karate. If there was, the entire foundation he'd built his life on would shake. Harrington had never admitted that, not even to himself. He only called it other names: skepticism, confidence, protecting tradition. But deep beneath it all was still the fear of being surpassed. And that fear fed his arrogance. It made him see Bruce as a threat. Not because Bruce was an actor or celebrity, but because Bruce existed as living proof that something outside karate existed, something he couldn't control. When he stepped toward Bruce earlier, when he spoke those mocking words, he thought he was testing someone else, but in truth, he was trying to protect his own image from collapse. And the exact moment Bruce defeated him in under 2 minutes, all the belief he'd built cracked, not because karate weakened, but because he realized he'd used karate as a shield against his own fear. Now sitting in the dojo with his body still aching and mind reeling, Harrington understood that the fight wasn't just a clash. It was a brutal but necessary reminder. Karate had forged him into a warrior, but ego had blinded him. And this truth, however hard to swallow, had begun to seep in, bit by bit, like the first light piercing the wall he'd built around himself years ago. Bruce watched Harrington for a long time. When he saw Harrington's breathing stabilize more, Bruce moved a little closer, still keeping enough distance to avoid pressure, but not allowing him to evade this conversation. "You know," Bruce said, voice low and calm, "I used to be like you." That sentence made Harrington lift his head, eyes still clouded but confusion instantly turning to attention. Bruce continued, "When I was young I fought a lot. I wanted to prove I was right. I thought if I was faster, stronger, I'd win everything." He nodded slightly, acknowledging a not-so-glorious part of his past. "I clung to Wing Chun like the only truth. I believed if I just stuck to that pattern, I'd be unbeatable." Harrington listened silently, and in his eyes appeared something familiar, the image of himself years ago, rigid, full of belief, full of fear of being shaken. Bruce went on, "Then I met people who didn't fight by any pattern. They didn't follow the logic I knew. They forced me to look again." He looked at the tatami, voice lowering. "I realized I didn't lose because Wing Chun was weak. I lost because I only saw Wing Chun. I didn't see the truth." Harrington's mouth twitched slightly, not a smile but a reflex at hearing something too much like himself. Bruce leaned slightly toward him. You're the same. When you fought me, you didn't see me. You only saw karate. You thought karate had to win. He said it directly. No hedging. Karate doesn't fight. Only humans fight. Harrington clenched his fist, but this time not from anger. Bruce continued, voice even, you weren't bound by karate, but by the ego you built around karate. You weren't afraid of losing. You were afraid karate would lose. You were afraid your meaning would be shaken. Harrington bowed his head, breathing slowing. This was seeing himself. Bruce sat level with his eyes. Jeet Kune Do isn't a style, it's a way of seeing. It taught me to discard what binds me to one shape. He spoke each word clearly. Absorb what is useful. Discard what is useless. No one in the dojo breathed heavily. Bruce continued. Water doesn't choose shape. It chooses truth. People are strong, not because they hold one pattern, but because they see what's really happening in front of them. Harrington looked up, eyes wavering. Bruce looked into his eyes, voice soft but deep. When you fought me, you fought with fear. Fear that if karate didn't win, you wouldn't be yourself anymore. Harrington bit his lip lightly, and for the first time that afternoon, the hardness around him cracked. You don't need to abandon karate, Bruce said. Karate is part of you, but you must abandon the fear that anything outside karate threatens you. A long breath escaped Harrington's chest, as if he'd finally released something carried too long. He didn't reply, but his eyes were different. No more defense, no more stubborn arrogance, only real listening. Bruce nodded lightly, as if confirming what had just changed. When you set your ego down, you'll be stronger. Harrington couldn't speak, but everyone around saw his shoulders slump, not from defeat, but from finally stopping carrying the armor he'd worn for years. And in that moment, karate was no longer the prison holding him. It returned to its true nature, a path, not a wall, and Harrington, for the first time, began walking that path with truly open eyes. Bruce stood up first, as if leaving Harrington the necessary space to gather what had just been stripped from inside him. No one spoke. No one in the dojo dared break the enveloping silence the moment a man had just slipped out of his old shell. When Harrington finally managed to stand, though movements still slow and heavy, Bruce looked at him for a moment, then reached into his pocket. He took out a small piece of paper and a pen, wrote a few short lines in quick but neat handwriting, folded the paper in half, and handed it to Harrington. This is the address of Jun Fan Gung Fu Institute, Bruce said, voice neither forcing nor carrying the tone of a victor. If you want to learn the truth, come find me. The paper rested in Harrington's hand for a while before he opened it. Just looking at it, he already felt like he was holding a door to another path, one he'd never thought he'd walk, much less be invited into. The dojo students watched the scene with completely changed eyes. No more fear, no more seeing Harrington as a broken monument. They looked at him like someone who had finally found a way out of the war with himself. Some bowed slightly, as if showing a respect newly formed in just minutes. Some looked at Bruce, then Harrington, then back to Bruce, as if trying to memorize this moment to retell years later. Harrington took a deep breath. Not the breath of a fighter rising after a match, but of someone standing before a choice big enough to change a lifetime. He opened the paper, just a few lines, short address, phone number, dojo name. No extra message, no note, no warning or encouragement. Only what was needed, a destination. Why? Harrington said softly, eyes still fixed on the paper. Why do you want to teach me? Bruce didn't answer right away. He looked around the dojo at each face, each still confused eye from the fight's aftermath. Then he turned back to Harrington and said, "Because you've seen the crack." Harrington frowned. Bruce explained, "People only learn when their shell starts to crack. Most run when that happens. But you stayed." Harrington's expression changed slightly. Not pride, not shame, like realizing something he'd never named. Bruce continued, "You're strong, but you're strong in a way that forces you to protect yourself from truth. If you're willing to learn again from the beginning, you'll be strong in a way that no longer needs to hide." The students hearing that understood Bruce wasn't speaking to teach just one person. He was teaching them all. Harrington gripped the paper tightly, feeling the edge cut lightly into his hand as if reminding him this wasn't a dream. He looked at Bruce again, and now his eyes held no opposition, no arrogance, no distance, only acceptance. Acceptance that the path he'd walked for years might not be wrong, but it had stopped long ago, and if he clung to it, all he had was a wall. Harrington opened his mouth but stopped. He couldn't find words to fit the feeling. Bruce didn't wait for the full sentence. He just nodded once, lightly, as if confirming what needed saying had been said, what needed understanding had been understood. When Bruce turned to pick up his towel and training bag, the students automatically parted to make way. No hurried footsteps hit the tatami. Every movement slowed, as if the entire dojo was stepping out from another state. Harrington looked at the paper once more, then tucked it inside his shirt, right over his heart. He knew exactly what that meant. Not surrender, not abandoning karate, but facing the new truth he'd always feared, looking at directly, facing himself. As Bruce walked out of the dojo, the door closing softly behind him, Harrington stood in the center of the tatami, head not bowed, hands not trembling, just standing still with a stillness he'd never felt so clearly in his life. And in that stillness, he made his decision. He would go to Los Angeles, not for revenge, not to reclaim honor, but to relearn what he'd just understood today. Truth has no style, and his karate would only be truly strong when he had the courage to step out from his own shadow. 6 months later, on a cloudy morning in Los Angeles, Harrington stood before the wooden door of Jun Fan Gung Fu Institute. He had traveled a distance far greater than miles could measure, 6 months wrestling with himself, 6 months dismantling old beliefs layer by layer, 6 months seeing karate not as a shielding wall, but as part of a larger path. When he knocked and stepped inside, only Bruce was in the center of the training floor, adjusting a young student's stance. He turned at the sound of footsteps, nodding lightly as if Harrington had only left yesterday. "You're here," Bruce said, and that made Harrington relax shoulders he hadn't realized he'd unconsciously tensed. The session began not with advanced technique, no complex moves, no display. Bruce simply asked Harrington to take stance and relax. "You're too stiff," Bruce said, when he saw Harrington raise his hands defensively. "You're trying to control every movement. That's why you're slow." Harrington felt awkward. All his life he'd been taught strength lay in solidity, tensed muscles, unshakable stance. Bruce stepped forward, touched his shoulder with 2 fingers, and pushed lightly. His whole upper body shifted slightly. "See," Bruce asked. "Stiff isn't strong. Stiff is brittle." The training lasted hours, and what Bruce taught wasn't how to strike, but how to release. Release stubbornness. Release patterns Harrington once saw as immutable. Release the need to be right. By the time Bruce called for a break, sweat ran down Harrington's back, not from exertion, but from constantly breaking reflexes, deeply ingrained over years. When the two sat to rest at the edge of the tatami, Harrington looked at his hands a long time before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" Bruce nodded. "That day when we fought, were you ever afraid?" he asked without looking at Bruce, as if the question was so heavy it had to be placed down gently. Bruce was silent a few seconds, not hesitation, but as if giving the answer the respect it deserved. "I was afraid," Bruce said. Harrington looked up immediately, eyes unable to hide surprise. Bruce continued, "But I wasn't afraid of you." Harrington frowned, not understanding. Bruce pointed to his own chest. "I was afraid of my ego. The only thing that makes a man lose when he should win." He spoke slowly, giving each word time to sink in. "Fight to prove. Fight to protect my image. And every time I did, I grew weaker." Harrington took a very deep breath. Bruce looked at him, voice soft but firm. "You didn't lose to me because karate lost. You lost because you were afraid karate would lose." A long silence settled between them. Not heavy, not painful anymore. Like just enough space for a new idea to enter. "So what do I do now?" Harrington asked for the first time without any resistance in his voice. Bruce answered immediately, as if this was the question he'd waited 6 months to hear. "You learn to set your ego down. When you can do that, you'll see what you didn't have time to see that day. Truth doesn't side with the strong or weak. It sides with those who see it." Harrington sat still, feeling the words spread through his body like warm water. And he knew from that moment onward, his learning was only truly beginning. Not learning strikes, not learning speed, but learning release, learning openness, learning to see. And for the first time in his life, that thought didn't scare him. It made him feel light. Bruce stood up, extending his hand. "Continue." Harrington took his hand, stood, and knew he had chosen the right path. Not the path of karate or Jeet Kune Do, but the path to becoming himself, without hiding from truth anymore. Years passed since that afternoon. Harrington stood on the tatami in Los Angeles, breathing as if he'd just stepped out of his old self. He continued returning to Joan Fan Gung Fu Institute regularly, not to learn techniques, but to learn seeing, to learn letting go, to learn expanding himself beyond boundaries he'd once believed fixed. Bruce never treated him as a beginner to teach from scratch, nor as a failure needing comfort. Bruce simply pointed out things Harrington had never dared face: binding habits, rigid beliefs, unconscious reactions he still clung to like a life preserver. And then, one day in 1973, news of Bruce Lee's death spread across Los Angeles like a blow no one could block. When Harrington heard it, he stood frozen in the middle of his own training room. He didn't believe, couldn't believe. The man with the most intense life force he'd ever known, whose calm eyes seemed nothing in the world could shake, gone so suddenly. A few students training stopped and looked at him, surprised by the emptiness on his face, something they'd never seen in their strict teacher. Harrington sat down at the edge of the tatami, the newspaper reporting Bruce's death placed on the floor beside him. He didn't cry, he just sat there a very long time, as if trying to find breath again somewhere lost in memory. That evening, when the dojo gathered all its students, he knew he had to say something, not out of a teacher's duty, but because there were things Bruce had given him that if he didn't pass on, they would be lost forever. He stood in the center of the dojo, no training gear, no imposing master's demeanor, just a man carrying an indescribable loss on his shoulders. "Today," Harrington began, voice lower than usual, "you've heard the news about Bruce Lee. The entire dojo fell dead silent. He let the silence stretch a few more seconds, as if what he was about to say needed space to reach the deepest place in the minds of those standing before him. "There's something you don't know," he said, "about an afternoon in Venice, many years ago." Then he told it, not as a tale of victory, but as a confession from a man who once thought himself invincible. He told how he stepped toward Bruce with arrogance he himself hadn't recognized. He told how Bruce evaded the first punch with a movement so small even he couldn't see it. He told of the sweep that dropped his whole body before his brain understood what happened. He told of the final strike, the strike that shattered the image he'd built of himself over years. "That day," Harrington said, voice no longer trembling but heavy like earth, "I didn't lose to a man. I lost to my own ego." The students looked at him with eyes even he found strange. Not pity, but respect for someone brave enough to say what not everyone had the courage to admit. "Bruce didn't just defeat me," Harrington continued. "He set me free." He told of the 6 months after, of going to Los Angeles with a heart full of doubt, but feet that wouldn't let him turn back. He told of the first training session, where Bruce asked him to relax his shoulders instead of tensing them. He told of the sentence Bruce left in him like a blade, but also like a key. "You weren't afraid of me. You were afraid of your ego." Then he spoke, for the first time with certainty, not from muscle power, not from victory, but from understanding. "If I hadn't met Bruce that day, I might have lived my whole life inside a shell I thought was strength, but it was only fear wrapped in steel." The dojo was silent. No one moved. You could hear the ceiling fan turning in the space between his words. Harrington took a deep breath, looked at each face turned toward him, and finished with the sentence he'd kept in his heart for years, a sentence he'd never said aloud to anyone but himself. "Truth always wins." Bruce Lee was the truth that day. When he finished, he bowed, not in mourning, but in reverence for a man who had awakened him from the mental trap he'd created himself. And from that day forward, every time Harrington stood on the tatami, transmitted a technique, corrected a stance, or taught a student a philosophy, he always remembered he wasn't teaching karate to make anyone a version of himself. He taught so they wouldn't repeat the mistake he'd carried for half his life, confusing strength with ego. And in his heart, Bruce Lee's lesson continued to live, spreading to every generation of students he guided, like a stream that never stops. Thank you for following the story to the end. If you'd like to read more works in the same style, please subscribe so you don't miss out. See you in the next parts.